What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to my channel. With Halloween Ends wrapping up the Halloween series for the time being, I wanted to get in one more video on the series, and that's ranking all 5 timelines from worst to best. Similar to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the Halloween franchise is one of those horror series that's known for its many different timelines, with every few movies being reboots that ignored the continuity of some of the films coming before them. And it resulted in 5 distinct timelines, all of which admittedly have had their ups and downs, but depending on who you talk to, you'll get a completely different answer as far as which one they find to be the true definitive Halloween timeline. And I mean that when I say it depends on who you talk to, because this is one of those franchises where there's very little consensus as far as which of these movies are the best and the worst. But that's what makes a list like this all the more fun. So with that, before we begin, let me know in the comments what your ranking of the Halloween timelines are. As always, this is just my list and not a definitive ranking. Also, make sure to hit that thumbs up button if you like these videos, as it helps me out immensely by getting my content out there. And if you're new here, I hope you consider hitting that subscribe button so you can stay up to date with more movie related content on a near daily basis. Also, last thing, these will not be my full thoughts on each of these movies. I did review all of them individually and ranked every movie, and I'll leave a link to that video so you can get more of my full-blown thoughts there. But it's worth noting, there will be spoilers for just about all the Halloween movies in this video, as my explanation regarding where these timelines rank does involve getting into most of these movies' endings. So, if you haven't seen all the Halloween movies by now, this is your spoiler warning if you still wish to know nothing about whichever ones you haven't seen yet. But, all that being said, let's not waste any more time, and let's jump into the list. In last place is the H2O timeline, which consists of the original movie, Halloween 2, H2O, and Resurrection. Now, this had the potential to rank a little higher on this list. Obviously, the original is a classic. I didn't like Halloween 2 so much. I know that one has its following, and some do consider it one of the better sequels, but that one just wasn't for me. But things definitely bounce back when we get to H2O, which might feel in some ways more like a Scream movie than a Halloween movie, but it was still a nice return to form for the franchise due to its more character-driven elements. This is definitely one of the best characterizations of Laurie Strode, with her dealing with the trauma of the original encounter with Michael, but done in a way that felt very grounded and gave a lot more meaning to her arc. And in H2O, we got what was supposed to be a satisfying ending to the series, with Laurie killing Michael. And had it ended there, this would have easily been in one of the top spots on this list. But then Resurrection royally screwed the pooch and brought the whole thing crashing down. One of the very few things in this series most fans can agree on, it's that Resurrection is a bottom tier Halloween movie. You always find it either in last place or second to last place on most lists. And that's because it's the most insulting of all of them, for the way it undoes the very satisfying ending of H2O, saying Michael switched places with someone at the last second, meaning Laurie killed an innocent person. And then Michael kills Laurie in the first 15 minutes of Resurrection in a way that's totally unbelievable and in a way that goes completely against her character, making this one of the worst send-offs for Laurie. And we then shift to a new group of characters who you honestly couldn't care less about, and from there, just about everything Resurrection can do wrong, it does wrong. The acting's bad, Michael feels shoehorned into the story, you have all this shaky camera work to replicate the vision of security camera footage and it just makes the whole thing disorienting, and the encounters with Michael himself just felt lackluster. Now, some of it does teeter on it's so bad it's good territory. Busta Rhymes in particular gets in some pretty funny lines, if you ask me. I know some people generally don't care for him here at all, but beyond that, Resurrection undoes anything good in this timeline that came before it. And if this actually wound up being the final film in the Halloween franchise, it would have honestly tarnished its entire legacy. So despite H2O being better than a lot of the movies in these other timelines, I gotta count the whole story arc, and unfortunately, Resurrection cancels it out and then some. Number 4 is the Thorn Timeline, consisting of the original, 2, the Return of Michael Myers, the Revenge of Michael Myers, and the Curse of Michael Myers. This is another one where I don't particularly care for a number of the movies on this list. I listed my thoughts already on 1 and 2, and after a break from Michael with Season of the Witch, 4 not only delivers on its title with Michael himself returning, but it also marks a return to form for his storyline. I think 4 is overall one of the better installments in this entire franchise. I like the introduction of Jamie Lloyd and Rachel. I found them both to be interesting, and depending on who you ask, some people will even call Rachel one of the better protagonists in this franchise, and this movie brings a sense of fun with some of its more over-the-top kill sequences, while also still maintaining a nice sense of dramatic tension, culminating in one of the series' more haunting endings, with Jamie channeling that same remorseless energy that Michael has to Loomis's despair. It leaves things on a pretty great note. But But similar to what Resurrection did to H2O, 5 undoes any of the good 4 did, with 6 even further muddying the waters. 5 is one of the dullest entries in this entire franchise, with almost no sense of dramatic tension whatsoever. Like, there are a few moments where the soundtrack choices just won't fit what's actually going on screen, on top of long stretches at times where it'll just feel boring. And again, it's a bit insulting in the way it kills off Rachel within the first act. It makes Jamie a considerably less interesting character by rendering her mute and giving her this psychic connection with Michael, and meanwhile we also get introduced to this cult storyline with a figure known as the Man in Black, which gets further explored in the overly convoluted Curse of Michael Myers, where it tries to explain that these sinister forces are actually behind why Michael is the way he is. It gets weird. And in 6, while it's nice seeing an early Paul Rudd performance as a now grown Tommy Doyle, it also contains an anticlimactic ending for Jamie, who, like some other characters I mentioned earlier, gets killed off early and in a way that just did not really do her character any sort of justice, with the film just moving on from her. The series had such an interesting new protagonist to explore in 4, and it just then squandered all of her potential with 5 and 6, which are 2 of the worst entries in the series for me, both only above Resurrection. And despite this containing more movies I disliked than the H2O timeline, and the fact that I like H2O a little more than 4, the reason I put this above the H2O timeline is that while 5 and 6 can make some pretty insulting choices with its protagonists, Resurrection takes the cake in terms of insulting, considering how iconic Laurie Strode is compared to either Jamie or Rachel. And Resurrection ends its particular timeline by just becoming a totally different movie. At least with the Thorn Timeline, it still doesn't work overall, but I can at least somewhat commend it in regards to 2 things. One thing, while the cult storyline just doesn't work and it's antithetical to John Carpenter's original themes, I can at least respect it trying something ambitious and trying to bring greater meaning to the series. It's messy and convoluted and it barely makes sense, but it at least swung for the fences, and I can at least give it some credit there. On top of the fact that these movies never pivoted into something entirely different altogether. It didn't feel like the first and second halves of each movie felt totally disconnected from one another. You still had Loomis and some other supporting characters tying things together, with it just being a shifting focus on who our secondary protagonists were. It was a bit annoying to say the least, but at least it all tried tying together into one overarching story. Did it work? Not at all, and that's why it's so low on this list. But it's done in just a bit more of a cohesive way that it puts it a notch above the H2O timeline. Number 3 is the Anthology Timeline, consisting solely of Halloween 3, Season of the Witch. For those who are still unaware by now, after Halloween 2, the franchise was supposed to take on an anthology format of completely separate movies, all taking place on Halloween night, but in their own respective timelines, each focusing on brand new characters. And the idea got scrapped after just one movie, which was Halloween 3, Season of the Witch. And it's partially because this only amounted to one movie is why it's number 3 on this list and not any higher. We never really got to see what this format could have amounted to. So, while I do like this one movie, it never really got to reach its true potential of exploring all these different styles and subgenres of horror, all centered on this theme of taking place on Halloween night. But the one movie we got was good. It's by no means my absolute favorite Halloween movie, but it's definitely one of the better entries. It's not thematically strong like John Carpenter's original, and it's not as quotable, nor does it have as memorable of characters, but it is some schlocky B-movie fun, going for a more sci-fi inspired approach than the rest of the series, which were all slashers. But despite it not being a slasher, it still takes a bold approach, as it has probably one of the biggest downer endings of the entire series, considering the villain's plan ultimately comes to fruition, with a lot of the targets also being younger kids as opposed to teenagers. It's a hell of a way to go out, if you ask me, with our protagonist pleading for everything to stop as he helplessly hears this fatal broadcast across the airwaves. It would have been cool to see where this anthology format could have gone, and it's a shame it didn't totally work out. But at the same time, it also means we wouldn't have gotten the first and second spots on this list. And our runner-up is the Rob Zombie timeline, consisting of his reboot in 2007 and its sequel in 2009. And this is one timeline that's probably the most polarizing among fans. Rob Zombie does have a cult following within the horror community, and die-hard fans of his may find themselves really loving some of the deviations he made from the original source material, but there are just as many longtime Halloween fans who declare his movies 2 of the worst in this series, his second movie especially. Now, to be clear, these movies definitely have their problems. In fact, in my ranking of all the movies individually, I did rank both of Rob Zombie's films lower by just a bit than Season of the Witch. But I put this timeline as a whole higher than the anthology format because, we at least got to see a little more of this timeline explored, as opposed to the anthology format amounting to just one movie. But even that aside, I actually like both of these movies. Neither of them are what I'd immediately put on if I wanted to watch a Halloween movie, but I do admire what Zombie was going for here. Even if it truly didn't amount to much and it does go against what John Carpenter's original was about, I did like the attempted exploration into why Michael is the way he is, him going from this troubled boy into this cold-blooded killer. Even if it hit some generic story beats, I thought these sequences were done well enough, despite some bad acting from Sheridan Zombie as Michael's mom. But they added some decent character development to an otherwise mysterious figure. And I also particularly liked the way the sibling storyline was handled in these two movies. I was not the biggest fan of how the original Halloween 2 handled the sibling stuff. I thought it absolutely added nothing to either the story or Laurie's character development. But in this Halloween 2, we actually see it explored more and we actually spend time with Laurie upon her learning this shocking revelation. And I think it made this version of Laurie very compelling, and it made the overall story of this Halloween 2 more interesting. And while I know not everyone was the biggest fan of this, I also like the arc of Loomis, going from someone who tried to stop Michael, thought he succeeded, and then capitalized upon people's obsessions with true crime and serial killers in the aftermath. He does take a pretty sharp turn from the first movie, where he goes from being one of the most likable characters to one of the least likable characters, but I did appreciate what these movies were ultimately going for with him by giving us a different sort of thematic exploration into the different ways in which these true crime stories leave the legacies you don't particularly want them to leave. And with that, in terms of just pure slasher chaos, I think this delivers, if you like bloodier slashers at least. There's an overall grisly feel to these movies, but the carnage is certainly cranked up in many instances in ways that it doesn't feel overly depressing, and if you have fun with gory slashers, you won't be disappointed. That all being said, these movies can still feel uneven in terms of acting, the stilted dialogue, and the fact that, as I mentioned, it'll go for deeper meanings, but ultimately not quite say as much as they wanted to say. But unlike the Thorn or H2O timelines, I found this to ultimately stick the landing. It's not a perfect ending, it might not have the best or the most absolutely satisfying of all these endings, but I can watch both of these movies back to back and say I was at least fine with the overall experience while still acknowledging the many imperfections. But in first place is the H4O timeline, consisting of the original movie, Halloween 2018, Kills, and Ends. And this is another one that many fans will find polarizing. A lot of people have had plenty of issues with the David Gordon Green trilogy, and there are imperfections in those movies that I do acknowledge. But to me, despite their flaws, this is the closest I felt this series has come to having any consistency, sticking the landing more on its thematic explorations, as well as having one of the more satisfying endings of all these timelines. And even if they are to continue with this franchise down the road, which I'm sure they will, it's been made clear that this is the end of this particular story, so I imagine whatever comes next will be a total reboot. So there should be nothing undoing the ending this time around. But you have the original, which, as I've said, is a classic, for its scares being more atmosphere-driven and the fact that John Carpenter was looking to explore the nature of evil, with Michael Myers being this mysterious entity who is remorseless and does what he does with no real exploration beyond that he's evil. This then drops the sibling storyline, ignores the events of literally every other movie, and just goes straight to Halloween 2018, which, like H2O before it, is an exploration of the trauma endured by Laurie as she lets the events of that one night consume her all those years later. And while some might have some issues with Laurie feeling more like a Sarah Connor or Ellen Ripley here, and might not fully buy into her arc, in these movies, I actually do think this is one of the better characterizations of Laurie. And honestly, this is a hot take, but I found Laurie more interesting in 2018, and in H2O by the way, than in the original. She gets considerably more to do in 2018, and we get more of an insight into her psyche. Whereas in the original, which as a whole I do like more, she's mostly off to the sidelines, unaware of what's going on in the town until like the last 20 minutes or so of the movie. It's an iconic final act, don't get me wrong there, but if you compare to how Laurie's explored in both movies, she definitely gets a lot more to do in 2018. And while some have questioned if David Gordon Green actually had a plan for a trilogy from the start, I do like what was at the heart of each of these movies, where you let the evil you set out to destroy consume you. It's not explored in a way that's perfect, but it's in a way that I found to be a more fulfilling experience. From 2018, you have then Kills, which is mostly meant to be a fun movie of Michael going on a rampage throughout the town, with probably some of the gnarliest kill sequences in the entire movie, fully living up to its name. But you do also have this notion of the town being so consumed with rage and revenge that they start to become the thing they set out to destroy. Now, I don't think it was fully explored the best. Those scenes in the hospital where they chant "Evil dies tonight" and they mistake the one escaped patient to be Michael, I found that to be one of the most unbelievable things out there, but I understood what the movie as a whole was going for, and despite its faults, it was a fun slasher overall that I think got better on repeat viewings, though I think I might be on an island with that statement. And then Halloween Ends. It's meant to be an exploration again of how evil consumes us and how it takes shape, and it leaves a lingering presence even when the figure representing that evil is gone. You have Michael off to the sidelines for much of the movie, and it's now a new figure, Corey Cunningham, at the forefront, who becomes Michael's protege of sorts. Now, this does fall into a trend of most of the timelines on this list, where the ending is the weakest entry in comparison to the rest of the movies in their respective timelines. The main thing this has working against it is the fact that it's the last movie in a trilogy, and yet it spends much of the movie setting up and exploring an entirely new character who's our main focus years after the events of the other two movies. So in some ways, it does feel a bit disconnected from 2018 and Kills, and it does feel much of the movie would have been better suited as a middle entry in the series rather than a finale. And it can be uneven in the fact that the way the film segues from Corey's story to giving us the true final showdown between Laurie and Michael, it comes off as very choppy and disjointed. The way it pivots to Laurie and Michael's climactic battle, it is at the expense of the storyline we just spent the previous hour and a half focusing on. So in that regard, it does make this an overall hit and miss experience. But unlike Resurrection or Halloween 5 or 6, the hits still outweigh the misses. I think once you get adjusted to this abrupt shift to Corey Cunningham as our focus, the story on its own is actually interesting, especially as you see how, like what we briefly explored in Kills, you see how evil has essentially consumed Haddonfield, and everyone looks for some new figure to be their boogeyman, and how they're still going on about those events all those years later, as traumatic as they can be. And you see how Corey, who started off as someone in the wrong place at the wrong time, fully embraced the narrative placed upon him that he actually is this irredeemable person. Even though he doesn't intentionally kill anyone in the film's opening sequence, it wound up being an accident, he's still deemed to be this cold-blooded killer, which becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy as the movie goes on. And while it's an abrupt shift from his storyline to the showdown between Laurie and Michael, we do at least get a satisfying conclusion to Laurie's storyline and one of the most definitive endings we could have ever gotten in any of these storylines, with Laurie and the townspeople doing everything they can to ensure that Michael is actually dead this time. Like, that Shredder sequence was actually pretty hilarious just for the extra precautions taken, given how Michael always finds some way to come back in these movies, but not this time. And then there's no ambiguity this time around. There's no surprise twist ending. It actually ends with Laurie and her granddaughter finding some sense of inner peace after all these years of turmoil. And both them and all the townspeople finally find it in them to move on. I thought it was a nice ending. Say what you want about the journey, but at least the endpoint is something definitive and satisfying. And it was done well enough. Ends might not be one of the absolute best of the Halloween movies, but when you take a look at this journey as a whole, it's the closest to the most consistent, it's the one where the good mostly outweighs the bad, it's the most definitive, it's the most satisfying, and it comes in as my number one of the Halloween timelines. But let me know, what's your ranking of the Halloween timelines? Did you agree with this list at all? Did you disagree with it? Let me know in the comments below so we can discuss. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and share it, and for more movie reviews and film discussion, please make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay updated. Thanks for watching, everyone, and keep having fun with film.